The Lord said unto Abram, Get thee out of thy country, and from thy kindred, and from thy father's house, unto a land that I will show thee. And I will make of thee a great nation, and I will bless thee. From the first 2 verses of Genesis chapter 12, in the King James translation. Welcome to the Western Traditions Podcast. In the last episode in this series about the Bible, we met for the first time a man named Abram, who would have lived somewhere around 4,000 years ago in Mesopotamia. And so we have left behind the primeval history of the Bible and entered now into chronological history, into a time and place that we can locate on a timeline and a map. Abram, we have to remind ourselves that he is not yet called Abraham. Abram is roaming with his large extended family up from the city of Uruk in modern-day Iraq and across northern Mesopotamia and then down into the Holy Land. According to a strictly biblical timeline, Abram would have been born sometime around the year 2167 BC, and we should consider the following events of Genesis 12 to begin sometime at or after the end of that century. Other views place Abram's birth later, a little after 2000 BC. Nevertheless, we are either in or fast approaching a recognizable period and place of history. The first series of my historical podcasts, which are on the same website as this biblical series of episodes, is about the ancient world. Now, if we were trying to place Abram in the episodes of that series about the ancient world, we would be right around episodes 16, 17, or 18. The 18th episode in that first series is called Second Mesopotamia, and it is about the old Babylonian Empire that succeeded the Akkadian Empire in Mesopotamia at about this time, near the end of the 3rd millennium BC. The biblical text, though, is little concerned about political matters, about marking the dates of history. As we progress through the pages of the Bible, we will naturally hear about some events in the Near East, and we will hear the names of certain historical rulers, such as Pharaoh Shishak or the Assyrian king Sennacherib. But the Bible is primarily concerned with spiritual matters, even when it happens to include some history. What matters is how Abram responds to God's wishes, not ancient geography or the name of whoever rules whatever land through which he is traveling at that time. Notice you'll never hear the name Hammurabi in the document of the Bible, even though he was a ruler at this time, probably the most important ruler. None of that matters. What matters is Abram's faith. Now, as we begin, be aware that Abraham, this is the name by which the man is remembered, even though right now in chapter 12 his name is Abram. Abraham is a large figure in both Judaism and Christianity. Moses and Jesus are remembered more often, of course, and often deemed more important to the overall narrative of the Bible, but without Abraham, we get to neither of those biblical figures. Abraham is the one man from whom the whole family of Israel is descended. Up to this chapter, we have heard about the many descendants of Noah and about the peoples related to the Hebrews, but the Hebrews themselves are, or consider themselves to be anyway, all the direct descendants of Abraham. And Jesus, in the Gospels, will reference Abraham multiple times, so this is a figure of Hebrew history whose importance should not be underestimated. Let us proceed then to examine Genesis, chapters 12 and 13, with the 4-part tool of exegesis and discover more about how God interacted with a man and his family as he wandered the lands between Mesopotamia and Egypt, some 4,000 years ago. The 12th chapter of Genesis can be neatly divided into 2 pieces. The first 9 verses give us a more complete introduction to the figure of Abram and include an episode in which God first makes and establishes a covenant with him. The following 11 verses describe Abram's journey to Egypt. The chapter begins with the name of the Lord, here given simply as YWH in the text, the Tetragrammaton. It's literally the first word of the chapter. The Lord tells Abram to go forth from Haran, a city in northern Mesopotamia, and to go to Canaan. Now, Haran is the city to which Abram's extended family traveled in the last chapter. Canaan is that region of the Levant, of course, which essentially lies within the modern state of Israel. The Lord then promises Abram that he will make a great nation of the man, that he will not only bless Abram, but also bless those that bless Abram and curse those who curse the man. In fact, the Lord then says that all the people of the earth will be blessed through Abram. That's a pretty indiscriminate blessing. The Lord then basically declares a great pact or alliance with Abram. But note a couple things here. The Lord does not even really ask anything of Abram in this passage. This moment in biblical history is often remembered as one in which the Lord offers all these things to Abram and simply requests faith in exchange. But really, God doesn't ask anything of Abram. He just says, I'm going to make a great nation of you. And Abram takes the deal and goes with it. Also, note that the Lord does not promise the land to Abram, not in this passage. He simply says here that he's going to make a great nation of Abram, meaning that Abram is going to have a lot of descendants. And this is a big deal because we learn in the subsequent verses that Abram is already 75 years old. And in later chapters, we will also learn at this late stage in life, he still has no descendants, no sons or daughters. His marriage with Sarai, that's Sarai with an I at this point in the story, she's not yet known as Sarah with an H. His marriage with her is a barren one. And you might be tempted to say, well, 75 is not a big deal in biblical ages. I mean, Noah didn't have children until he was 500 years old and so on. But that is not the case here. It is a big deal. However long people may or may not be living in this era of the Bible, Abram is quite conscious that he and his wife are getting a little too old to have children. That is why Sarai is in such a state of despair in the coming chapters that she offers her servant woman to her husband in order for her to essentially bear surrogate heirs. So Abram gathers his household, that is, all his goods and belongings and the people who are related to him and those who serve him, and they head for Canaan. And among those traveling with him is his nephew Lot, who has basically his own household or sub-household. We'll get into Lot's identity a little later. But focus for a second on that term, household. In recent times, the quote-unquote nuclear family has acquired a sort of pop culture popularity or infamy, depending on your political stance. People are either for or against the idea or the adoration of the nuclear family. That is the most likely suburban existence of a family centered around a father and a mother with their own children in a home, which they share with no one else. This type of family could be, in conversation or debate, opposed or compared to an earlier model, the extended family, in which a home might contain multiple interrelated family groups, possibly with a nuclear family at the heart of it all, but there'd also be a cousin living with them and a grandparent, etc. And if the family were wealthy or had land, there would possibly be hired hands, servants of some sorts, and so on, all included in the idea of a family, included in the idea of a household. That latter example is actually what we are talking about when we talk about the households of Abram or of Lot or of any other patriarch about whom we will speak here soon. We're not just talking about him and his wife and their kids or anything like that. A household of one man might be several dozen people, because it would include extended family members and servants and slaves and so on. It is presumed that Abram was a pastoralist, a nomad, like Abel from an earlier chapter, and had many herds of animals with him, which would require numerous servants to manage. In Abram's particular case, though, his household does not include any direct descendants at this point. So when this whole household comes down into Canaan, they travel as far as Shechem, an ancient city which stands still under its modern name Nablus in central Israel. This city is situated between or near several significant mountains, including Mount Gerizim, Mount Ephraim, Mount Ebal, and Mount Gilboa, where lies the pass of Megiddo, remembered in the book of Revelation as the place in which the final battle between good and evil will take place, at the mountain pass called Armageddon. Those other mountains will all figure prominently in future scriptural passages, but we're getting real far ahead of ourselves here. So, in this same verse in which Abram comes to Shechem, it is noted that he comes to a great tree, the oak of Moreh, as it is sometimes translated. And here he received another message from the Lord, from YHWH. Now, the importance of trees in the Old Testament is often overlooked. This is not the only sacred tree that will figure in the story of Abraham, and clearly not the only important tree in the story of the Bible, which began with the trees of life and of knowledge of good and evil, and will end with the tree of the cross. Here, at this tree, the Lord reveals to Abram that he will give all the land that he sees around him to his children, to Abram's offspring. In response, Abram builds an altar there by the holy tree. Note that Abram has yet to speak in this narrative. He has responded to God with actions, with movement, and with the construction of an altar. But he hasn't spoken with him, not in the text of the Bible. And then Abram moves on to the desert. He has learned from an oracle, a vision, a prophecy, that his descendants will own this land. But he himself has been promised nothing yet, so he moves on to the deserts of the south. On to the south and on to a very curious adventure, which is strangely paired with such a noble passage as we found in the first half of this chapter. You see, there's a famine, and we're going to hear a lot about famines in the Bible. So Abram immigrates with his whole household down to Egypt for relief from this famine. And here already has the story of Israel become entangled with that of Egypt. Abraham's descendants will return to Egypt in the future and become a nation of slaves there before departing en masse in the Exodus centuries later and come back to the promised land in Canaan. And Egypt, as Israel's next-door neighbor, will continue to have strong influence on Hebrew religion and politics. That country on the Nile will be mentioned several times by the prophets. They will war against or alongside Israel more than once, and the Holy Family, Jesus, Joseph, and Mary, will endure their own brief exile there in much later times. And later, in post-biblical times, Egypt will become a major center of both Christian and Jewish culture and philosophy. It is therefore hard to overstate the fundamental way in which Egypt has had an influence not just on Judaism and Christianity, but also on Western civilization, given the way that it impacted both Greek and Roman cultures. But getting back to the text, our intrepid and faithful hero, Abram, as he makes this journey to Egypt, is concerned that his wife is so beautiful that some Egyptians may kill him in order to take her away. Now, before we get to the morally complicated part of the passage, we should call to mind the difficulty that we might have in reconciling this passage with Sarai's age. We have already learned that she's quite old, and therefore it seems unlikely that she's going to be beautiful in a sexually attractive way that will motivate this sort of kidnapping. And as she will proclaim later, she's nearing the end or past the time of her fertility. So it's hard to see why Abram thinks that she will be stolen away from him. It seems like this would be a more appropriate story from an earlier time in Abram's life. And this is not the only time that we will have trouble with the timeline in the story of Abraham. In a future episode, we will grapple with the text which states that Abraham's concubine, Hagar, will be said to carry away her son into the desert with her. And people will typically depict that scene with showing a woman carrying a small baby into the desert. But if we actually adhere closely to the timeline of Scripture here, Hagar's son would have been about 13 years old at that time, and rather difficult for her to carry, but more on that discrepancy later. Now, instead of planning on defending his wife and her honor when pressed by some aggressive Egyptians, Abram, that is, asks her to pretend to be his sister, so that these same Egyptians will just take her away and let him live. As he says in verse 13, Say you are my sister, so that I will be treated well, and my life will be spared because of you." This does, in fact, happen. Sarai is noticed by the Pharaoh, who takes her away and gives Abram a lot of livestock and servants in exchange for the woman. Now, you may be just as eager as I am to jump into the moral quagmire that is this passage, but let's stick to our format and save the moral meditations for the appropriate segment of the podcast later. Anyway, in verse 17, we learn that the Pharaoh's own household, though, as a result of taking another man's wife into his home, the whole household is afflicted with some terrible diseases. The scripture is not specific about what they are. Pharaoh somehow realizes what has happened and why, and he returns Sarai to Abram and scolds the Hebrew man before sending him away. As chapter 13 opens then, Abram is returning to the Negev, that southern desert portion of Canaan. He's now very wealthy, presumably due to the Pharaoh's gifts, in terms of livestock and servants, as well as silver and gold that were gifted to him. And then, after wandering a bit, as nomads are wont to do, he came again to the place where he had erected the altar beside the oak of Moreh, near a place called Bethel, or Bethel, which is just an ancient way of saying the house of God. He's also near a place called Ai, which will figure importantly in the book of Joshua. And here, Abram calls on the name of the Lord, on YHWH. Now, some of the Lord's implied promises are already coming true now because Abram and Lot are now too many to continue together. And here we see a phenomenon that would have been common to our most ancient ancestors, even the hunter-gatherers. A piece of land can only support so many people. When a tribe was particularly successful in securing resources, defeating or driving off enemies, finding game, or planting crops, well, that tribe would enjoy a period of fertility and fruitfulness and see its numbers grow beyond what the land could support. And this was how tribes would end up expanding in ancient times. They would split up because their numbers became too large, too unmanageable in one place under one leadership. In fact, the entire grand household of Abram has indeed become difficult to manage because now there's fighting among the herdsmen who work for Lot and those who work for Abram. So Abram in chapter 13, verse 8 suggests the following: "Let there be no strife between me and thee, and between my herdsmen and thy herdsmen, for we are brothers. Separate thyself from me. If thou wilt take the left hand, then I will go to the right. If thou depart to the right hand, then I will go to the left." We should note here that Abram calls Lot his brother here in this passage, even though they're actually uncle and nephew. In ancient Hebrew, when one spoke of a close male relative, a brother, an uncle, a cousin, nephew, etc., you simply called them all brother. The word in Hebrew is ach. There is no specific word for those other male relatives. That is why the church has always maintained the perpetual virginity of Mary, even though the Gospels speak of the quote-unquote brothers of the Lord, because tradition holds that these men were not full brothers, that is, sons of Mary, but rather were other male relatives, half-brothers, cousins, etc. And the Greek word used in the New Testament for brothers, adelphoi, served the same purpose. It describes close male relatives, besides those who were also sons of the same mother and father. So Lot, anyway, in response to Abram's concern, takes his share of the men and livestock and slaves and so on, and heads toward the fertile lands near the Dead Sea, near the cities of Sodom and Gomorrah. The author of Genesis compares the beauty of these lands to the beauty of paradise. But Abram continues on in Canaan, the land promised to him. At this time, the Lord repeats the promise made to Abram in the last chapter, that he will give all this land to Abram and his descendants. In a future episode, I will address this issue of repetition in Scripture. It is something common throughout the Bible, all the way into the New Testament, that is, passages in which we see ideas and commands and stories repeated, sometimes more than once. And you might wonder why we have to keep hearing about the promise being given to Abram if it's so clear to begin with. But for the moment, I'm going to let that matter rest, and we will come back to this idea of repetition in chapter 20 when there's a really great example of it. Now, beyond promising Abram the land, though, now the Lord also makes clear to Abram that he will have descendants as numerous as the dust of the earth. It's important to understand that terminology. The Lord is not just saying you will have a lot of children. He's not even saying that you'll have a whole nation of children. More than the sands of the earth. Now, it's common to portray the ancients as ignorant of things like basic math and physics, but this is completely false. People had a firm grasp on numbers and quantities and the laws of physics thousands of years ago, maybe tens of thousands of years ago. Otherwise, the pyramids and all those other great pieces of architecture could never have been built. So the biblical writers understood very well that all the particles of the dust on the earth were a virtually infinite number, not something to which the population of even the largest human country could compare. So, with this promise of unimaginable fertility made to an old man with no descendants, Abram travels now to the trees near a place called Mamre and builds an altar in that grove. Covenant theology is a branch of theology that focuses on the promises and pacts which God makes with humanity throughout the Bible. This theological framework, this focus on the covenants which God makes with man, begins with the covenants that are made with Adam and Noah, and this theology then finds them boldly and explicitly stated again in the story of Abram. The covenant between God and man will be reiterated in later chapters with Abram, but one of the classic covenant episodes is that which appears in chapter 12 of Genesis. This covenant, this promise is, in Christian eyes, made with all of humanity, in a sense, with those descendants who are going to be as numerous as the dust of the earth. Significant here, too, is the unlikeliness of it all, that God could give anything to Abram. When the promise is made, Abram is already quite old. This is part of something also that distinguishes Hebrew heroes from most pagan heroes. The latter sort of hero, the typical pagan hero, is usually young, strong, a warrior of some sort who goes on great adventures and overcomes challenges with his strength or his wits, like Gilgamesh or Achilles or Odysseus. The Hebrew hero is often not young. He's sometimes an old man like Abram or like Noah. He's not strong. He's not particularly clever. In fact, he's usually an extreme underdog, the Hebrew hero. He's the last person you would expect to overcome adversity. And his fortunes are always contraindicated by his circumstances. Abraham, an elderly nomad with one elderly wife and no children, is not the man that you would first consider as a candidate for being the inheritor of a land, a faith, and ultimately the world. Now, Samson and David may initially appear to be exceptions to this rule, both of them being young and strong at the start of their stories, but a close reading of their stories also reveals that they share a crucial character trait with the other less likely heroes of Israel. They all attribute their success to the Lord, to YHWH. When they don't do this, when they forget to honor God, they fail in their mission in life. Abram then is not only a typical hero of the Hebrews, but he's also a type of Christ. And we've talked about typology before, about these things that prefigure things. In the Old Testament, they prefigure things that are in the New. So then, because Christ is also a traditional Hebrew hero, just like Abram, he's the unexpected hero who prevails in a different way than the Gilgameshes and the Achilles of the world prevail. His victory is through perfect faith in God, just as Abraham's faith is perfect, or as perfect as human faith can get. We'll get to see how far this faith goes when we come to chapter 21. And I bring up the typological nature of all this now because getting back to the covenant made with Abram here in chapters 12 and 13, this covenant is also a type. Just as we see human figures in the Old Testament standing in as types of Christ or sort of shadow versions of Christ, prefiguring the Savior. And just as we see certain objects performing other typological duties, such as the tree and paradise as a type of the cross, or the Ark of the Covenant as a type of the Virgin Mary, we also see abstract concepts in the Old Testament functioning as types of the covenant given to mankind in the New Testament at the Last Supper, when Jesus tells the apostles, "This cup which is poured out for you is the new covenant in my blood." And Abram's faith is also a type of the faith that will be required of Christians thousands of years later. As I pointed out at the beginning here, Abram does not get the promise in exchange for his faith, though the scenario is often depicted that way. Yes, Abram is faithful, and God cherishes that, but the original covenant simply promises fertility and land to Abram, without any strings attached. You see, God gives this gift to Abram because he, the Lord, YHWH, is good. He doesn't gift the land to Abram because Abram is good. There's no down payment to be made for these gifts of God. Read the verses again at the beginning of chapter 12. "I will make of you a great nation, and I will bless you." There's no mention of any merit on Abram's part, nor is there any request for something in return. As the prophets will later say, speaking in God's voice, "I already own everything," God says. "The entire universe is mine. Why would I need anything from you in return?" You know, a priest once counseled me regarding the Eucharist, which we will see prefigured here in the next chapter. The priest told me that too many people worry about being, quote unquote, good enough to receive the Eucharist. God doesn't give you communion, he said, because you have done something right or because you are good. God gives it to you because he is good. When people speak about the patriarchs of the Bible, they're usually speaking in particular of those men that came before Moses. That is, the leading men of the book of Genesis, in the family tree of Adam that runs through Noah and Abraham down to Joseph. These patriarchs, while revered in both Hebrew and Christian traditions, often do things that are forbidden under the later Mosaic law and according just to baseline Christian morality. And for thousands of years now, theologians have wrestled with this conundrum, with these patriarchs getting up to some weird shenanigans, many of them sexual. I bring this up now because Abram has already done a couple things here in just this first chapter introducing us to the man, things that fly in the face of traditional morality. Really, even a much more liberal modern morality would have trouble with Abram's deeds here. And that's something to think about. There are things that Abram will do which are not just in violation of some super strict interpretation of biblical morality. Even modern day self-serving hedonists would be repelled at some of the things that the patriarchs will do. Now, before we even get to the issue of Abram loaning out his wife and the underlying cowardice of the act, understand that Abram is not actually lying here in this passage when he says to Sarai, "Tell them that you're my sister," because she is his sister. As we learn in chapter 20, when Abram explains his next attempt to give up his wife to another man, that's right, he does this more than once, she is his half-sister. Sarai is the daughter of Abram's father by a different mother. But the Bible does not scold this clear incest, and the traditional way of explaining this away is to say that the Mosaic covenant had not yet been given to the Hebrews. In the law which God, through Moses, imparts to mankind in the books of Exodus and Leviticus and so on, it only in that law is incest of this sort, marriage with your half-sister, specifically and explicitly forbidden. And in fact, there is an internal logic to this argument that incest did not become forbidden until much later in the history of the world, because if we're going by strictly biblical accounting of the world population, with Noah's descendants being the only people on earth after the flood, it would have been necessary for a good amount of incest to occur in order to keep the population going. So even traditional theologians do not struggle too much with explaining this moment in Scripture. Abram gets a pass because there was as yet no restriction on this type of marriage. And we already know that in Egypt, whose influence on Hebrew religion I previously mentioned, marriage with siblings was not prohibited at all. Much more disturbing, though, to any reader of the Bible, is Abram's plan to save his own life by lending out his wife to any man who threatens his well-being. He fears that because Sarai is so beautiful, that he himself will be killed by one of her admirers and then she will be stolen away. So Abram's solution is simply to pass her off as his sister so that he can surrender her to any one of these admirers and reduce his risk of being killed. Now, we can try to explain away this behavior. We can try to excuse Abram as a man in fear for his life, but we have come to expect heroism, not pragmatism, in our biblical heroes. In the books of Samuel, David will undergo combat fearlessly. The prophets of later times will publicly pronounce their judgments on Israel without fear of the legal and mortal consequences of their words. In the New Testament, Jesus and the apostles will risk their lives and embrace punishment and fear of death as a sign of their devotion to their God. There simply is an expectation of heroism on the part of biblical figures. Yet Abram is more than just excused from guilt for this apparent sin. It's not even mentioned. The Bible simply passes over this story without judgment. And perhaps worse, through the lens of strict biblical sexual morality, is that Abram is apparently permitting his wife to potentially bed another man. Now, the story seems to indicate that this did not actually happen, that God warned the Pharaoh away from bedding Sarai with an affliction of diseases. Nevertheless, Abram seems to be apparently okay with that possibility. And it's hard to overstate the seriousness of this. No other biblical protagonist will stoop this low. Now, yes, David will commit adultery and actually kill a man in order to essentially steal his wife, but first of all, he's chastised for doing that. And second, there's just something worse about a man who would be willing to abase himself in this way, to give up his wife to another man in order to save his own life. And that actually makes it seem a worse stain on the soul than even murder might be. Perhaps, though, this story is ultimately meant to inspire us with hope, as unlikely as that may seem, because Abraham, as he is later known, will be remembered by later men, such as the Apostle Paul, for his faith more than any of his deeds or errors. Maybe the message is that no matter how low we go, no matter how far we fall away from grace, faith can still save us. And of course, there's also one more argument, that maybe Abram's faith was so great in God that he knew that nothing bad would ultimately happen in these circumstances. That's actually not as weird an argument as it seems. As you'll see, we're going to come to chapter 21, and Abram will be asked to do something unimaginably horrible, and is saved from the consequences of that by his God. So perhaps this passage is trying to tell us that, but there's nothing in the text that suggests that this was any sort of sign of faith on Abram's part. In the Bible's beginning chapters, we see, though through a glass darkly, as the saying goes, the way that things will come to an end. Abram's story, found so early in the Bible, is already focused on the promised land and on its inheritance. Now, Christians will see in God's promise of land here a type of the promise to come, the promise of an everlasting life. The peace and nourishment to be found in the land promised to Abram are types of the peace and sustenance that Christians will someday find in hearing the gospel and in entering into everlasting life with God. Indeed, already in the time of Jesus, as can be seen in the Gospels themselves, it was common to refer to the quote-unquote bosom of Abraham as the afterlife destination of good men. So again, we have here in these opening chapters of the Bible more forward-looking connections to the very end of the scriptural journey. And we have another clear demonstration of faith and of its overwhelming importance to God. And by faith, I do not simply mean some sort of creedal faith, however important that may ultimately be. People make a lot of that from this passage, that Abram just sort of believed in God. I mean, I'm not talking about faith as simply the verbal and interior intellectual assent to some doctrines about the nature of God. I'm not talking about someone simply professing, for example, that there's only one God, or reciting in the creed that God's Son rose from the dead. No, Abram's faith is not just intellectual. It's not just that he sat there and believed what God told him. That is not why God cherishes his faith. Abram's faith is demonstrated not with his words or his thoughts, but with his actions, with his works. Abram believes God, so he goes to Canaan. Abram believes God will give him descendants and a land as an inheritance, so he travels to Egypt at the risk of his own life, and he endures there, and he is rewarded for it. Abram believes God, so he builds an altar and calls on the name of the Lord. While the city of Jerusalem is not yet mentioned in these passages yet, we already have here much of the settings also for the final book of the Bible, the Apocalypse of St. John. Abram has wandered through a valley not far from Megiddo, the place where the final battle will take place. He has called on the name of the Lord. He has built altars, and altars play an important role in the apocalypse as well. As Abram continues his adventures in the coming chapters, we will see more episodes that prefigure both the church and the apocalypse, such as the Eucharistic ceremony of chapter 14 coming up next, or the macabre sacrificial rite of chapter 15, and much more beyond that. Perhaps the greatest example of a type to occur in these chapters will be in chapter 21, when Abraham raises the knife over his only legitimate son in obedience to his God, and as a demonstration of his faith.